Hey guys, welcome back to another Caseus Q&A. For those of you who are unfamiliar, this is a Q&A just dedicated to people who want to ask questions about the Book of Caseus or the characters inside it. So, without further ado, let's get to it. From Nolan UNO. 1. Who will Caseus, Sarah, and Corbin romance with if they played Star Wars The Old Republic, and why? I don't know. To be honest, I didn't really play Star Wars The Old Republic, so I don't really know too much about it. I couldn't answer that. Number 2. What would Takai say to her unborn child when she got into heaven? P.S. Yes, I know heaven as we know it doesn't exist in Star Wars, but please just roll with me. I think she would just be elated to finally see her child. The idea I had in my head is that if their child had been born, it would have been a boy. So I think it would be a boy. She would just break down and just hold her child. She would just be so emotional. Number 3. Do you think actress Natasha Karam could play Takai in live action, possibly in her younger years? Looking at some of these photos, yeah, I do think it's possible. I think there's a lot of actresses who would make a really good Takai in live action. Again, it's one of those roles that it's less about appearance, because makeup and hair can take care of a lot of the appearance side. It's mainly about how the character is and if the actress can pull it off. Thank you for your questions. From Ultra Shadow 95. Hey man, I hope you're doing well, so let's get this underway. Number 1. If Caseus went to Lothal instead of Dantooine at the end of Inner Storm and eventually encountered Ezra after he lost his parents, would he take him in and train him in the Jedi arts? Especially considering he'd be able to go through the same story beats as Jedi Exile with the Lothal Temple. If so, how powerful do you think Ezra would have become, considering Season 2 Ezra was more powerful than Cal at the end of Fallen Order when training under Kanan for just under 2 years? And this statement of Season 2 Ezra being stronger than Fallen Order Cal can be backed up with the tie-in novel where Cal and Merrin use their strongest spells, using her strongest spells got absolutely decimated by the Fifth Brother, whereas Ezra could hold his own on a regular basis. Long question. I think if Caseus went to Lothal, there's a chance he might end up training Ezra. I think Ezra would remind Caseus a lot of Corbin because their personalities were a bit of the same. They're both kind of jokers, both full of confidence. So I think it's possible. And whereas Caseus and Liara have a very father-daughter relationship, I think Ezra and Caseus would have more of a kind of like a older brother, little brother relationship. It's possible Ezra would have become more powerful, but, we can't know for sure. That might be something to do in a what if down the line. Who knows? Number 2, this question somewhat ties into my question from the last Q&A. What do you think would have happened if after losing to Caseus at the temple, Corbin instead decided to become a Red Hood-esque vigilante in the Coruscant underworld, not discovering Palpatine's plans or anything like that, just straight up crime fighter, and furthermore, how would Caseus react if they met again? I think it's possible Corbin could go that route, but if, the story beats stay the same, he would still be, wanted by the Jedi and the Republic for what he did. But if he encountered Caseus again now as kind of like a vigilante, kind of like Red Hood, I think Caseus and Corbin would probably fight again, maybe not to the death, but Caseus would want Corbin to stop what he's doing and, come back and, try to fix things. And Corbin would not want to do that. He'd be trying to take matters into his own hands. Number 3, who would you say Prime Caseus is comparable to in terms of skill, power, and experience? I'd say Caseus is in his prime. I'll actually be answering this question again later. I think Caseus is in his prime probably around the time of the Inner Storm, around the end chapters, because he had spent a full year and some change training, a very, very difficult, very harsh training under Dravok. So physically, mentally, and in terms of his skill, he was probably at his peak there. So I'd say at that point, he's probably comparable to, I'd say Anakin around the beginning of the Clone Wars. Maybe a little bit, towards the end. That's not to say he's more powerful than Anakin. He certainly isn't, and we've seen that. But in terms of just who he would be most comparable to in that situation, I'd say that was probably his peak. If not Anakin during the Clone Wars, you could probably compare him to maybe Obi-Wan's level around the middle of the Clone Wars, at least in terms of, like skill with a blade and force abilities. But I don't know. That might be a question that might be a question to think about. Number 4. What would Caseus and the other main characters like Liara, Corbin, Sarah, etc. think of the lightsaber pistol concept? Would they be stuck in horror like Obi-Wan? Like Obi-Wan would be, or would they be jealous they didn't think of it? It depends. I think it depends on when we're looking at Caseus. If it's him before Nightfall, I think he'd probably stick to the lightsaber. He'd probably see the blaster as unnecessary. Sarah, I think probably the same way, especially since she already uses 2 lightsabers. Corbin, I think, would be more open to the concept, anything to give you an advantage. And sorry, I'm having an issue with my microphone, so you're probably hearing a little bit of a rattle. Hopefully you can still hear me. And Liara, I think, kind of in the same beat as Caseus. You'd have to kind of look at when this is. But I think she also would kind of stick with just the lightsaber. Next question. Who's more traumatized, Caseus or Spider-Man? It's kind of like comparing apples to oranges. Like the trauma that both these characters have gone to is, very different for both of them. I don't know. It's kind of a coin toss depending on which version of Spider-Man we're talking about. Number 6. If the Caseus cast ended up playing Batman Arkham Knight, what would they think of Jason Todd? And yes, I know a lot of these are Red Hood-based questions, but I've been playing Gotham Knights as Red Hood recently, and these questions have been on my mind, so I thought I'd get them out of my system. I don't know. Like I said, I'm not really too knowledgeable about things like Batman. I do know Red Hood and Jason Todd, so I think they'd all probably think that he's pretty cool, especially Corbin. I think, Corbin being the guy who's really into the guy who's more of like help others no matter the cost, and putting an end to evil no matter what. So I hope that answers your question. From Diamond 360, one more question. Sorry to bother. No bother. But how did you manage to get such a captive audience for Caseus with your channel? How do you hook people with the pitch beyond your already fantastic writing and story? I tried starting my own OG character-based story, in large part due to the inspiration of listening to Cassie's journey way back when, but my story has never managed to get anything in terms of views. How have you managed to make Caseus as much of a success as you have, and what tips would you be willing to give to a newbie such as myself? Here's the thing, and I've said this before. I started putting up the Caseus chapters just as a way for me to record my story and make sure that they were saved, so I never forgot the story or it was never lost. I was just putting them up basically as like an archive, just to say, all right, here's my story. I'm just going to put it here on the channel so I have it. But people started, listening to it, and more people started coming to the story and listening to it and enjoying it. And all I was doing was just telling my story. I didn't put up Caseus looking for views. That's the first big tip I'll give you. Don't be doing this just to get views. I know it's one of those things you want people to notice your work. You put a lot of work into it. But don't go in expecting, hundreds and hundreds of views. For me, the videos that get the big views on this channel are the what ifs. And I enjoy doing the what ifs, but at the same time, I like telling my own story. And the tips that I would give you in how I've managed to make Caseus what it is, and I'm super thankful, so grateful for everyone who's been enjoying the story. The tips I would give are, first of all, make sure that the equipment you're recording on is decent. You want people to be able to hear. You want the audio to be pretty clear. And I'd say in terms of writing, be creative. Like, create new characters. Don't just rely on established characters. Tell the story you want to tell. Whether other people think it's good or not, don't worry too much about that. If you have a story that you want to tell that story. If people enjoy it, they'll let you know. People will come to your story in time. It just takes patience, persistence, and, you just got to have a passion for telling your story. I'm passionate about Caseus. It's a story I'm proud of and I want to tell. I hope that answers your question. From Jordan Cox. Hello, Concordia Jedi. I hope you're doing well. I have 3 questions for you. 1. How would Caseus feel about the Grey Jedi ideology? I think Caseus would probably feel kind of the same way I feel. And again, it depends on what your definition of a Grey Jedi is, because there's some people out there who think a Grey Jedi is someone who, they can use the light side and the dark side with no. The dark side is corrupting by its nature. There's no safe way to use it. That's why the Jedi are so wary of it. There's no safe way to use the dark side. By its nature, it will corrupt you if you use it too much. Or if you try to use it at all, even. It will try to corrupt you. And so if it's that mindset, Caseus would definitely be against it. He would say, stick to the light side, don't draw upon the dark side. It will corrupt you. Now, the way I kind of interpret the whole Grey Jedi thing, and I don't even really agree with the name. You're either a Jedi or you're not. But like people like Qui-Gon Jinn, where his allegiance was less to the Council and the Republic and more to the will of the Force, I think Caseus would be more inclined to agree with that ideology, although he, being a Jedi Padawan during the time of the prequels, probably also felt the sense of honor and duty to the Republic and the Council that many of the other Jedi did at the time. Number 2, if Caseus ever went up against Count Dooku, would he have ultimately lost to Dooku? Yes. There's very few iterations of Caseus that would not have lost to Dooku. Dooku was arguably the greatest duelist in the history of the Jedi. And it took Anakin Skywalker, the chosen one, to defeat him. I think any fight between Caseus and Dooku, especially during the Clone Wars, would not have ended well for Caseus. He would have put up a fight. He wouldn't have gone down immediately, but he would not have lasted too long. And Dooku, I think, would have eventually, beaten him and killed him. Number 3, how did you come up with the idea of Darth Vader training and torturing Liara in Jedi Redeemed? Was it outlined from the start, or did you come up with it last minute? Have a great week. It was something that I had planned from the beginning, ever since Liara came into being as a character. That was always part of it, is that they would get separated, by, Dotame and his men, enemies from Cassius' past, and Cassius would be sent to Kessel, where he would suffer and be enslaved for 3 years, thinking Liara was dead. Meanwhile, Liara would be rescued, but by her enemies, and Vader would torture her, using her as a way to root out Cassius. Because, again, Cassius is not, in Vader's mind, Cassius is not his great rival. I always like to think of the line from the Street Fighter movie. Terrible movie, but it has a great line that I think really fits the relationship Vader has with Cassius. That line would be, "The day M. Bison stormed your village was the most important day of your life, but for me, it was Tuesday." Vader does not see Cassius as a rival. He sees Cassius as a loose end that needs to be tied up, especially that Cassius knows who he is. That's why he's trying to find Cassius so much. It's not that, he has a deep hatred or rivalry with Cassius. It's that Cassius knows who he is, and he's a loose end that needs to be taken care of. But yes, it was outlined from the start. It was not something I just came up with at the last minute. Thank you for your questions. From 212th Trooper, if Cassius knew about the World Between Worlds, would he attempt to use it or prevent its use by himself and others? Again, the World Between Worlds, as Dave Filoni says, it's not time travel, but assuming that that's the the route we're going down, let's assume that it is like time travel. Caseus may try to use it if he knew about it. But again, you have to look at it from a canon point of view. The world between worlds is not time travel. Ezra was able to save Ahsoka because that's how it always was. But whereas, and they show when Ezra sees Kanan in the world between worlds, he thinks, I can save him, I can stop him from dying. But if he had done that, they all would have died. And Ezra would not have gotten to the world between worlds in the first place. It was a lesson to Ezra that he had to let go. And there are many instances where Cassius probably could have saved, people from his past, but at the cost of, never getting to the world between worlds to do that in the first place. It's very complicated, and that's why I don't really mess with the world between worlds when I'm doing my writing. It's just a bit too complex. There's too many holes that can be opened up, so I try to steer clear of that. Thank you for your question. From Diamond360 again. Oh, this was your first questions. Hello there, I deliver my questions here. 1. Beyond stories such as Takai and Lineage that serve as add-on stories to the Cassius timeline surrounding different characters, are there any other characters you would be interested in telling stories of? Perhaps Gaidom for the long period we didn't see him in after Dawn of War, Corbin's journey with his master that led to his mental state being fractured and his turn to the dark side, Liara's Jedi father who we never met, or something completely different. I have some ideas. Right now, the main ones that are planned out are Cassius Clone Wars Chronicles, once we finish up with Jedi Redeemed, the Takai novel, and Lineage is still very early in development. Lineage is something that's kind of a joint project with Star Wars Elseworlds, but I'll talk more about that when we get closer to actually putting out chapters of Lineage. And I do have some ideas with Gaidom, but nothing's concrete yet. You'll just have to wait and see. Number 2. Now that we've seen the fate of Liara and her newfound loyalties to the Empire, I wanted to ask which branch she serves under. In Jedi Redeemed, Vader regards her as a tool, so I'm guessing she's not his secret apprentice or something. But beyond that, does that mean she would be considered an Inquisitor, an Emperor's Hand, an Imperial Shadow Guard, or something else entirely? I think the closest thing you can call Liara at this point is Vader's assassin. She's his tool. She's not his apprentice. She does have some authority over troops, but only that which is given to her by Vader. If Vader said to his troops, kill her, they would do it without question. The only power she has right now is power that's given to her by Vader. She's not in any position of command unless Vader puts her in one. Right now, she is just a tool, so I think the closest thing you could call her is Vader's assassin or Vader's slave. Number 3. How has the story of Cassius changed and evolved in certain story beats based on how canon has released more stories within the timeline? So far, I've gotten pretty lucky in this sense because I've said before, I try to tie Cassius into canon as much as possible so that it seems like a story that could fit within canon. And so far, nothing has been released that has really conflicted with the Cassius story. Every once in a while, I might change something up just because it's a little too similar to something that happened in the current canon, but nothing major. Number 4. Lastly, a totally serious question. If you've beaten Jedi Survivor, what do you think would happen between a meeting of Pip the droid and Turgle from Survivor? Do you think that together they would potentially be powerful enough to stop the almighty wrath of Rick the door technician, or would their powerful presence be locked out? Ooh, that's a tough question. Now you got me thinking. Ooh, I don't know if they'd be strong enough. Rick is one of the toughest bosses in that game. I don't know. That's up in the air. Thank you for your questions. From Tim McClaymont, do you have a Patreon or something similar? Yes, I do. I will link it down in the description below. It's Concordia Jedi at patreon.com. Thank you. From Midnight, can you describe Cassius' lightsaber hilt? And number 2, what does Master Takai's lightsaber look like? Cassius' lightsaber, I think, is probably fairly simple. Probably a similar emitter to Obi-Wan's lightsaber, that kind of flanged emitter. Simple grip section, something that's easy to wield and use, two-handed or one-handed. And I think in terms of the design or the color, he'd probably have a pop of copper color in there or something. I actually had an artist do some Caseus artwork a while back, and the lightsaber that was used for Caseus, I'll put up an image, actually looks pretty close to how I pictured it. As for Master Takai's lightsaber, I never thought of what her lightsaber would look like, but I imagine probably something similar to Master Jocasta News, something sleek and elegant, with maybe a pop of gold in there somewhere. Thank you for your questions. From Quantum Beware. 2 questions over here. 1, what are the main characters' ages by the time of Jedi Redeemed? So, Caseus is currently 42 years old, approaching 43. Liara is currently, I believe, 20 or 21. Same with Bendel. Bendel is probably 21 or 22. He might be a year older than Liara. Gaidom is in his early to mid 30s, I believe. And there's a few others, but I can release a whole chart on their ages at some point in the future. Number 2, when Destiny's Rewritten happens, are you considering using some of your original cut ideas like Evil Takai and Cyborg Inquisitor Corbin? Love your stuff, excited for more. Thank you. Yes, I am planning on using some of my original cut ideas as alternate reality stories. Which ones I use, you'll have to wait and see. Thank you. From Zachary Wagster, I have 4 questions for you. When would you say Cassius Prime is? Like, where he's at with the peak of his lightsaber and force abilities. Like I said, Cassius' peak is most likely in the last couple chapters of The Inner Storm. That's, I think, when he's, at the peak of his prime. He's as trained as he's ever been with with his lightsaber and his force abilities. Because then after that, in Jedi Exile, he spends 8 years in hiding on Sabo's farm. And during that time, he loses a lot of his muscle mass. He's not training daily. He kind of loses a lot of that along with that spark inside of him. I'd say he then, in Jedi Master, starts slowly building back up to that prime era. And then by the time we see him in Ashes of the Order, I'd say that's the closest we see to him reaching those levels that he was at in Inner Storm. But again, after Ashes of the Order, he's on Kessel and loses a lot of that again. That's when I'd say his prime is probably the last couple chapters of Inner Storm. Have you ever written any scenes in the Cassius stories that you look back on and think that was unnecessary or was pointless to the plot? There are times I think that. Sometimes I think about Dooku from Jedi Master and think he didn't really serve too much of a purpose, but then I think, he did teach Liara, about, death and, accepting it and remembering what those who have passed on meant to us and the impact they had on our lives, no matter how small. There's others here and there that I look back on and I think, that might have been unnecessary or it didn't really add much, but never anything where I'm like, that was a mistake. I should never have done that. Not to my knowledge, at least. If Cassius was going to be adapted into a trilogy of movies and you had to choose one director to direct all the films, who would you choose? Well, I've said before, I think Cassius would be better served as a series, because there's so much. There's almost 9 books of Cassius content. So I think if you were going to adapt it faithfully, you'd probably have to do it as a series or multiple films. And I don't know. I think it might be cool to have someone like Peter Jackson give it a shot. He did great with Lord of the Rings. He's a very, he's a very, not avant-garde, because that's a stupid word, but he's one of those directors who likes to try new things whenever he's adapting something. And again, he did great work with Lord of the Rings, so I'd like to see his take on Star Wars. And finally, you don't have to answer this one since it's not Cassius related, but I was just wondering, do you have a favorite Star Wars author? If so, what is your favorite Star Wars book the author has written? I'd say probably my favorite Star Wars author is Matthew Stover, and definitely my favorite Star Wars book he wrote was the Revenge of the Sith novelization. And it's absolutely amazing. It is fantastic. I'd say probably my favorite Star Wars book of all time. And I think that if the movie had as much detail and depth as the book, Revenge of the Sith would hands down be the greatest Star Wars movie. Over Empire, over A New Hope, over any of them. Hands down, it would be that. I think that is a fact. Again, it's just my opinion, but I think it's a fact. Thank you for your questions. And finally, from Clone Commander Caleb, is Lineage going to be set during the Mandalorian Wars? So again, Lineage is still very early in development. All that I have right now is that it will follow an ancestor of Caseus, Gallian Urshan, and it will be set in the Old Republic. As to when exactly it will be set, that is still to be determined. Again, we're still early in development on this. But again, more information will come as we get closer. And I think that's the last question. Thank you all so much for your questions. We have more content coming soon, so stay tuned. We'll see you next time.